There is a wall in Zaria, Nigeria, that has stood for over 400 years. It is not the wall of a king. It is not the wall of a general who is remembered on postage stamps or taught in every history class. It was built, historians believe, under the order of a woman. Her name was Amina, and by the time she died, she had ruled for 34 years, expanded a kingdom's trade routes across West Africa, commanded armies in campaign after campaign, and left behind fortifications that still stand while the empires of some of her better-known contemporaries have long since crumbled to dust. Search her name online and you'll find dozens of videos calling her a warrior queen, a fearless ruler, a legend. All of that is true. But somewhere between the legend and the algorithm, the actual history, the parts we can verify and the parts we honestly can't, tends to get flattened into one confident, tidy story. We're not going to do that. This is her story, told the way it actually happened, with the myth and the woman kept clearly separate, because we think the real Amina deserves better than a highlight reel. To understand Amina, we have to understand where she came from. She was born around 1533 into the royal family of Zazzau, one of the 7 original Hausa city-states in what is now northern Nigeria. Her mother, Bakwa Turunku, was the ruling queen. Zazzau sat at the crossroads of major Trans-Saharan trade routes, which meant this was not some isolated kingdom. This was a hub of commerce, of politics, of constant contact with the wider world. Picture Zazzau in the 1500s. This wasn't a quiet farming settlement. It was a walled city-state sitting directly on the caravan routes that moved gold, salt, cola nuts, cloth, leather, and enslaved people across thousands of miles, from the Sahara in the north, down through the forest belt in the south. Merchants from as far as North Africa passed through Zazzau's markets. Whoever controlled this territory controlled a piece of one of the most important trade networks on the continent. That is the world Amina grew up watching and eventually running. From childhood, she was trained differently than most princesses of her era. She learned horsemanship, and in Hausaland, cavalry wasn't decoration, it was military doctrine. She learned the use of weapons. She learned the machinery of statecraft, how armies were provisioned and moved, how trade agreements were negotiated and enforced, how a kingdom actually functioned day to day, not just in ceremony. According to tradition, her grandmother gave her a horse and a slave at age 14 as a symbol that she was being groomed for leadership, not just marriage. By the time she was in her early 20s, she had already earned a formidable reputation. Not as an heir quietly waiting in the wings, but as a warrior and strategist in her own right. When her brother Karama became king, Amina served at his side for years, commanding forces in his military campaigns. She wasn't handed power. She built her credibility on the battlefield first, the same way any general, male or female, would have had to in that era. When Amina took the throne of Zazzau around 1576, she did not slow down. She accelerated. Tradition holds that she launched a military campaign practically every year of her reign. 34 campaigns is the number most often repeated, though we want to be upfront that this figure comes from oral history, not a written ledger, so treat it as tradition rather than an audited count. What's better documented is the direction of her expansion. She is credited with extending Zazzau's territory and influence across a huge stretch of Hausaland, pushing as far as Kano and Katsina into Nupe territory to the south, and, according to some traditions, toward the Atlantic coast. Along the way, she is said to have brought new city-states under Zazzau's control, sometimes through conquest and sometimes by compelling local rulers to accept vassal status and pay tribute. But the achievement most historians point to first isn't a battle. It's a wall, Amina is credited with introducing, or significantly expanding, the practice of building tall earthen fortifications around Hausa settlements for defense. These walls, sometimes called Amina's walls or Ganuwar Amina in Hausa, are attributed to her across multiple cities in the region. Some of these fortifications, remarkably, are still visible today, worn by centuries of rain and wind, but still standing as physical proof that this wasn't just a story passed down around a fire. Something was actually built here, with actual labor, actual engineering, actual planning for a threat that might come years after she was gone. And the economic side of this expansion was just as important as the military side. As Zazzau's territory grew, so did its control over the goods moving through it. Kola nuts headed north across the Sahara, cloth and leatherwork produced by Hausa artisans, salt coming down from desert mines, and the general traffic of merchants who needed safe passage and were willing to pay tribute for it. Some traditions credit Amina specifically with introducing kola nuts into the region's cultivated economy in a larger way. Whether or not that specific claim holds up to scrutiny, the broader pattern is clear. Expanding territory meant expanding control over commerce, and that revenue is almost certainly what funded the very walls and fortifications we've been talking about. Conquest paid for infrastructure. Infrastructure protected the conquest. It was a system, not a series of disconnected victories. There's a strategic logic underneath this that's easy to miss if you only think of Amina as a battlefield figure. Conquest without infrastructure doesn't last. Armies retreat, and territory reverts. But a walled city sitting on a secure trade route keeps generating revenue and keeps enforcing control long after the queen who ordered its construction has died. Amina wasn't just expanding a map. She was building a system, fortified cities, controlled trade corridors, and tribute relationships that could function without her personally present. That's not just military success, that's governance. This matters because it's easy for history to remember conquest and forget infrastructure. But infrastructure is what actually protects people. It's what allows trade to keep flowing, what allows a city to survive after the queen who built it is gone. Amina didn't just win, she built systems that outlasted her. Here's where we have to be honest with you, because that's what this channel is built on. A lot of what circulates about Amina online presents her story with total certainty. Exact numbers of cities conquered, precise details of battles, a fully resolved account of how she died. The truth is more complicated, and we think the complicated version is more respectful to her, not less. Amina's story comes to us primarily through oral tradition, the Kano Chronicle and generations of Hausa storytelling, supplemented much later by written accounts recorded during and after the colonial period. That doesn't mean it's false. Oral tradition is a legitimate historical source, and it's often the only reason we know about figures like Amina at all, because so much of West African history was deliberately dismissed, mistranslated, or simply not written down by later colonial record keepers who weren't interested in preserving it accurately. But it does mean that some specifics, the exact scope of her military campaigns, the full list of cities that credit her with their walls, precisely how many years she reigned in some tellings, even which century some of the earliest accounts place her in, vary depending on which version of the tradition you're hearing, and which colonial era writer transcribed it. And then there's her death. Some accounts say she died in battle, sword in hand, still leading her forces at the height of a campaign. Other accounts say she died of natural causes after returning from a campaign at a place called Ida, on the banks of the Niger River. A few traditions even differ on how many decades she actually reigned before that happened. We don't know which version of her death is the accurate one. And honestly, we're skeptical of any video that tells you with total confidence that they do, because that confidence usually means someone picked the most dramatic version and presented it as settled fact. What we do know, with much more certainty, she reigned for decades. She expanded her kingdom's reach, and the physical evidence of what she built has survived for over 400 years. That's not legend. That's stone and earth you can still walk up to today. Amina's name did not fade after her death. It grew. In Nigeria today, she's a national symbol. There are statues of her, streets and institutions named after her, and she appears in Nigerian school curricula as one of the most significant historical figures the country produced. In Lagos, a statue of Amina on horseback, spear raised, stands as a public monument to a queen who ruled more than 4 centuries ago. Zaria itself, the modern city that grew out of Zazzau, still carries her legacy in its name, its walls, and its identity as one of the 7 original Hausa states. She's also become a broader symbol across the African diaspora, invoked whenever people talk about African women in leadership, about pre-colonial African statecraft, about the fact that centralized, sophisticated governance in West Africa did not begin with European contact. It was already there, generations before the first European ship reached the Nigerian coast. Trade networks, fortified cities, military organization, succession systems that allowed a woman to inherit and hold power for over 3 decades. All of it predates colonization by centuries. Amina is proof of that, standing an earthen brick that has now outlasted the empire that once tried to write her out of the story entirely. We opened this video with a wall. We're going to close with one too, because that wall in Zaria isn't just a historical artifact, it's a statement. Someone built something meant to last, meant to protect people long after she was gone, and it worked. 400 years later, it's still there, while so much of what we're told about African history before European contact gets reduced to a footnote or erased completely. Amina ruled for 34 years. She expanded a kingdom. She built fortifications that outlived empires. And most people, including plenty of people who can name half a dozen European monarchs from the same century or have never heard her name at all, that gap isn't an accident. It's the result of centuries of historical record-keeping that decided whose stories were worth writing down and whose weren't. We don't think that decision should stand unchallenged. Every video on this channel is an attempt to close a piece of that gap. Not by inventing a cleaner, more heroic version of the past, but by putting the real, sometimes uncertain, always remarkable history back in front of people who were never given the chance to learn it. Amina didn't need us to make her legendary. She already was. She just needed someone to tell the truth about it. If this is the first time you're hearing about Queen Amina of Zazzau, welcome. There's a lot more where this came from.